All right. Okay, well then I'm just gonna jump right in this if you're ready.
Yep, I have my answers prepared so we can just kind of go through it quickly and
Great. Perfect. First of all, I just want to introduce myself. So my name is Kelly Graves. I'm a registered nurse, and I've been a nurse for 30 years now. And I just can't do the bedside anymore, but I love to teach. So I decided I want to go into teaching. I started getting my master's in nursing education, and then it dawned on me that maybe I won't always want to teach nurses. So I switched my program up, and then the whole COVID thing kind of made me think a little bit more. So I'm doing my master's in education with a specialization in e-learning and pedagogy. So if need be, I can actually just teach from home with this degree. So
oh, awesome.
yeah. I'm at a point in my career where I'm ready to just kind of stay home in my pajamas, and if I can do as much as I can from my living room, I'm kind of at that point. So.
Right.
All right, Lucas, could you let's go ahead if you could tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Luke. I'm a high school social studies teacher at Soldotna High School. Sohai has been my first professional teaching experience. Right after undergrad, I moved up here and just started. I just finished my third year today.
Nice.
Uh, Prior to that, I attended Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I did a lot of teaching internships there in schools ranging from sort of the most impoverished in our area, that our university was near, to the wealthiest in the area.
Right.
Um, so my whole idea and philosophy regarding education has been really heavily shaped by sort of where public education is right now, particularly regarding the experiences of working class and impoverished
Right.
communities.
Right.
Uh, yeah.
Wow. What brought you to Alaska? Was it because did it have anything to do with the fact that Alaska is in tremendous needs of strong educators?
So yeah, there was part of that. I had a couple family members who had lived up here tell me that, and then I think part of it was I wanted to make sure I had a job right out of undergrad. So I applied to pretty much like everywhere in the country. Alaska was the KPBSD was one of the first places to get back to me. Uh, decent salary, and
Mm.
after the interview, I liked some of the things they had said about how they structure education and whatnot. So I figured I'd give it a shot.
Nice. Well, 3 years into it now.
Yeah.
Nice. So starting with you've covered a little bit of your experience of working with underprivileged students. What is it like in this community, Lucas, as far as the lovely earlier you mentioned that you have the real impoverished and the real wealthy. Where does Soldotna sit in that realm?
So, if you were to just take a look at the student body, I think at least unlike some of the other schools I've been into, you can see that whole economic stratification within the student population.
Right.
There's a big chunk that I would say come from more privileged, wealthier backgrounds, or maybe their parents are business owners or own a lot of property. And then there's a lot of students whose parents work multiple jobs,
Mm,
that have to work themselves. I had so many seniors, especially this year, that had to work jobs just to keep going, keep their family going. And then, I had a handful of homeless students as well. So really the whole spectrum in there.
yeah. Oh, wow. That's amazing. What do you think about these kids? Okay, so you have your wealthy kids and you have the more on the impoverished side. Which ones of those kids are going to go on to college? And what are the odds of the more impoverished going to college? What do you think? Are we?
Yeah, so definitely, if I were to look at like the graduation rate, or the graduation statistics of like who's going to college, because I think right now it's so high, really only about a quarter or so of kids go to a 4-year university right afterwards. So the rest go right into work or military, or go maybe get an associate's degree or something.
Mm,
But it's definitely the kids that have the means to attend a university. I know the Alaska college system does a good job trying to keep costs low,
right.
but that price point's very difficult, and um, Yeah, it really is. I would say more of like that middle and upper class section of kids that go right to university instead of having to go right to work or some other way to get to
Right.
college.
Well, that kind of jumps me right into the whole the relationship between family income and a student's cultural background, the impact that that has on educational achievement. Are you seeing most of these kids who are going to college? Are those coming? Are those most that 25% generally coming from the educated population?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah,
And I think sort of the class structure that exists in our country, right? I would say poverty itself is pretty relegated to sort of these chunks of the working class. And
yeah,
then, me being a history teacher, social studies teacher, if you look at the US's historical legacy, the issues it's had to work through and the different types of barriers that's existed, like settler colonialism, slavery, different types of discrimination.
right.
A lot of this poverty and lack of opportunity is sort of displaced onto not just the working class, but especially the marginalized portions of the working class, so Black communities, Indigenous communities.
Absolutely. And it just continues on and on and on.
Yes.
Okay. Um, so so we're talking about not having equity. There's so little equity. How do we fix that? Is education that fix? And how do we get that education? And how do we stop this vicious cycle?
Yeah, that's tough, and I have a lot of different thoughts about that. Let me look at my notes here. So I really do think education is probably one of the most important or valuable tools for like sort of creating an equitable society. And I think there's a reason why, again, speaking from a historical position, education and land reform are always like the first two projects when a group of people try to sort of reconstitute their society.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so just a few examples here. So like when Europe went from reorganized itself from like a feudal society to a capitalist society, you had an explosion in the way education worked. Education used to just sort of be you were either trained theologically or you were trained in a way that you would help the administration of the state.
All right.
Uh, but once you moved more into that modern era, more capitalist style of organization, education started adopting more liberal ideas from like John Locke, and it became more accessible. I developed into like the Prussian model of education, where they're like, if we make education compulsory, standardized, um, and widespread with very specific curriculum, we can use it to sort of support our state.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of the issue with education comes into right now. One, the US hasn't really updated its educational system from that Prussian model in decades at best.
Right.
And I think public education, which is incredibly important, um, is we have to think about sort of like the function of public and state institutions, because they often are used to I don't know, reinforce and reiterate sort of like what ruling ideas are and ruling
Right.
organizations
Right.
are. So if we have a system where this sort of poverty exists, you're going to see that within the education system, and I think
Right.
that's where like the biggest challenge is.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big fix. I don't, and then with our leadership right now, have you ever seen so much censorship as since you've been maybe paying attention or since you've been aware of education and the impact by politics?
At least not as out in the open it has
Right.
been, especially like in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I feel like it's like news stories every couple of days about a
Yeah.
teacher
Yeah.
breaking some kind of censorship-based rule and getting in
Yeah.
trouble.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I know that what question wasn't on there, but that's one of the things as somebody who isn't a teacher and I'm not in your field, but I sit back and I watch the news and I'm reading these things and I'm appalled at what I just read that 1,500 books were just burned or were removed. I say burned, but removed from Florida libraries. And I mean, that's like daily. And it's just crazy that censorship is still occurring in our nation at the rate that it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
That kind of reminds me of that one of the questions you had in there about like the pros and cons of inclusion. And I could go
Sure.
on and on about all the different pros of inclusion. I think it's something we need to build towards. But the only con that kept coming to mind was every single time you have schools or school boards or teachers try to improve that, you're sort of met with a vicious reactionary movement, so to speak, that kind of tries to fight back against that. So whether that is a social studies teacher trying to explore racial history in the United States or wanting to have discussions or books in a health class about sexuality and gender, there's sort of this inevitable backlash from more reactionary elements of a community. And
Sure.
that's I think a lot of these troubles come
Sure.
from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and it seems as though everybody's opinion needs to be discussed and everybody needs to share their opinion now. Whereas before, as you mentioned at the beginning of schools, it was understood the purpose of schools, what they were for, and everybody was on board. But now it's everybody wants their way to be taught. Well, how, Luke, is that is possible to please everybody, every student and every student's parents?
Right. I even have a note in here that says, despite what I think people who are way too into like the spectacle of politics, what they think is that education's always been about instilling ideas and developing skills and critical thinking and stuff like
Right.
that, just like you just said. Um, um,
Creating
yeah,
good citizens who are going to who are going to contribute positively to our communities. And right now, I feel as though all this is doing is it's just creating more animosity between people who disagree and who don't believe in the same God or who don't believe in the same about sexuality. It's just, I don't know, Luke. I don't have children in the public school system any longer, but I don't see, it seems like a pretty big barrier that we have in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And right, that's why I always like to again consider what happens um when that, the current function of education is sort of challenged, right? If you want to think about the dominant social norms of this country the last 100, 200 years, where some of this backlash comes from starts to make sense. But as
Right,
people have more modern ideas, we want to be more inclusive, increase educational outcomes for everybody.
right,
Um, that's where that issue starts to get. And if the like small organized backlash doesn't work, you're starting to see whole states in this
right,
country that are organizing, like
right.
Florida, for example, right now,
Yep,
that are putting in institutional restrictions.
yep, 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 yep. I understand everything you're saying. Um, okay, so we talked about that, analyze issue of equality. So I guess equality versus inequality and what measures could be taken to combat this. That's, of course, I guess, a golden question in itself, and that's regardless of our socioeconomic status of our schools. Um, there's always been the inequality existing, but it seems like that it's widening and widening and widening. And what is their answer to help to make sure that we're getting those impoverished students up? How can we support so that Soldotna has more than 25% going to college, and maybe we can have a goal of 50% and at least half of those are from poverty stricken families. What is the answer? What is a dream answer for that, Luke?
Yeah. I wish I knew that, but short of completely, I guess, reorganizing how we, relate to one another and sort of organize ourselves in the
Yeah,
community, there's a couple things that can be done to sort of move the ball along. One of it, one of the things real basic is just sort of shifting the way we fund schools, right? Because
yeah,
public schools right now largely draw from property taxes.
absolutely.
So right there, you're going to see a lot of variation in outcome from, like, again, one of the schools when I was in undergrad that I interned at, I think the average household income for that school was something like $200,000 or $300,000.
Yeah,
Whereas I had another school the year before where most of the families there were below the poverty line.
right.
Uh, So changing the way schools get funding,
Right,
one that kind of prioritize not only education but basic human needs. Because a
right.
lot of my students who are lower income or even homeless talk about like when they get to school, they don't have the energy or the enjoyment to do it
Mm,
because they're not getting their basic needs met
yeah.
anywhere, right? They don't get enough to eat. They don't have a place to sleep.
Mm.
So, education and, basic human needs being provided,
So
proper
federal,
staffing, funding.
so you think the federal government needs to step in and needs to be more accountable so that the states aren't assuming this entire burden?
Yeah, I think they have a large role to play. I think state governments and local governments, I think really all three layers sort of need to
Yeah,
figure out what they're gonna, how to improve the way schools are funded. Because I
yeah.
was thinking, so I think this was back in maybe March or April, the district was talking about closing the pools and the theaters and cutting the jobs associated with them. And it led to this large public outcry. But everyone on like the board and the assembly said, "Oh, sorry, our hands are tied. You have to go yell at the state government." And then the state government sort of gave the same argument.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think, yeah, there's a big part of that. So I think professional educators having more control of the education
Yeah.
system, what we're trained to do and understand
Mhm.
and work with, because teachers, who have the greatest understanding of pedagogy and curriculum, we're pretty powerless when it comes to actually organizing schools and school policy.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
We can make a fuss, but
Mhm.
really most of the power that teachers have come to our own job security, but not the way schools actually run.
Right, right, right. Um, which is just, I guess, reflective of the whole national standards. The national standards are fine, but teachers feel, many of the teachers feel they should just be able to get their students there in the way they feel their students best can get there versus
Yeah,
being
absolutely.
told, yeah, being versus told exactly how to teach a certain subject.
Right.
What other objections do teachers have with all the national standards and the national testing?
So obviously, right, there's the whole thing where I think, most not only teachers, but people in general have developed a pretty negative view of standardized testing for a lot of reasons. It's not very honest representation of how students learn. We all
Right.
know that there's different ways students can take in information and express that information, but the same thing, you see the wealth inequality
Yeah.
sort of baked into standardized testing
Yeah.
as well. People from higher income areas who can afford tutors, private lessons, books,
Yeah.
proper staffing,
Yeah.
they do really well on their standardized tests.
Right.
Whereas schools that are understaffed and get no money and families can't afford private educational services, they
Yeah.
do not that great on them.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Luke, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This is awesome. Again, I appreciate your time and I appreciate your honesty and the transparency. And I guess that's it. Any questions or anything else?
No.
All right.
No, this was pretty fun to do. Just sort of, thinking about it. I spent a lot of time sort of trying to think about these questions, but
Yeah.
I like the questions you were thinking about because I think there's just a very strong positive correlation in this country between wealth and income and
Yeah.
educational outcomes, and that's just something that needs to be fixed.
Absolutely. My next project is to develop a plan, a plan of action. And my plan of action is going to be focused on how do we make sure how can we eliminate the inequities that are going on in at least our community. Maybe I can even start out in a school and develop some sort of a plan and walk through it. So it's going to be a challenge, but I think we all have to develop a plan and we've got to throw it out on the table and we've got to start working on it because that's the bottom line.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Things, at least, like, I try very hard not to be a cynical person,
Yeah,
especially in front of my students. But the way
sure.
things are looking, really big changes
Yeah.
need to happen, or
Yeah.
I think the public schooling system, which is under siege, is going to kind of collapse on itself.
I believe it is. I almost think that sometimes that has to happen. Things have to collapse. It's like the medical system, as the healthcare system. it's collapsing and it's going to collapse. And until it happens, I don't think we're going to rebuild it because we just keep putting band-aids on it. Same thing with the educational systems. Maybe it needs to collapse. Maybe we need to
Right.
start over.
Yeah, yeah. And I think until I don't know, they can create a way where education reflects proper priorities. Because right now schools still kind of strike me as like a factory. Bells dismiss students, everything's standardized and atomized.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Look, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Have a great evening.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.